All right, Lieutenant General retired S.L. Narasimhan is DG for the Center for Contemporary China Studies and member of the National Security Advisory Board. Ellen Dolkar is a member of Parliament of the Tibetan Parliament, which is in exile here in India. Professor Victor Gao is Vice President for the Center for China and Globalization and Chair Professor at the Soochow University. General Narasimhan, let me start with you first. How does India make sense of this? Does India even bother responding to this? I believe there's been a strong statement put out by the MEA spokesperson, by the Foreign Minister as well, and I'm given to understand that there was some kind of a démarche issued to the Chinese ambassador here in India as well. Is that the right response? Is that the right course of action?
Thank you very much for getting me on the show. First, let me correct my position because I have relinquished both my appointments recently, and so I am speaking in my individual capacity at this point in time. The issue is that we know that this issue is old. We also know that China has been issuing maps earlier showing incorrect alignment of the border. So this is nothing new. They keep doing this, as our foreign minister said earlier. The other thing that you talked about as to whether the response has to be correct, I think the response has been correct in the sense that the MEA, I'm sure, would have raised an objection on this and raised a protest. That, in any case, will go through the diplomatic channels. But your question of whether we should continue to keep talking, I think we should continue to keep talking, basically because that is the only way out at this point in time. However, to expect a solution very quickly is going to be a little impractical. We need to have our patience. We need to keep pushing our claim. We know exactly where our territories are shown in our map, and that is what we should be looking at, and that is what we should be discussing and pushing for.
So, Victor Gao, even if one were to be charitable, to take the charitable view of why China is doing this, it is one thing to say, okay, there are parts of the line of actual control that are not demarcated, that are disputed, there's a historic legacy, so on and so forth. But please explain to our viewers how China claiming an entire state, an entire province, in your words, the state of Arunachal Pradesh, I mean, how does that even begin or stand to reason? It's like tomorrow India is saying all of the Fujian province belongs to India. I mean, it's preposterous at the very least.
Now, when you talk about what the Indians call Arunachal Pradesh and what the Chinese call the South Tibet region, first of all, China has never recognized the Mahon line that the British colonists drew up. And that is an illegal line. China will never accept that. So where should be the boundary according to the Chinese perspective? Historically speaking, the totality of Arunachal Pradesh is not Indian. It is the Chinese territory. It is China's Tibetan territory. That's the reality. That's history. If you go there, for example, on a site visit, the people you see there are not Indian people. The people you see there are Tibetan people who traditionally have been part of China since the 13th century, I would say. And people there believe in Buddhism as people in Ladakh region. That is a
Professor
fact.
Gao,
you can do the survey by yourself.
Professor Gao, I mean, I'm really sorry. The logic of what you're saying is just, it beggars belief. And I'll tell you why. For over 70 years now, there have been elections in Arunachal Pradesh. When the 1962 war happened, there were Arunachal residents, Arunachal soldiers, and ordinary citizens who were fighting against China and for India. Today, you go there and do, by any yardstick, a dipstick survey or whatever you want to have, a referendum. I can assure you that 100% of the population of Arunachal Pradesh will say that they are Indian and they want to be seen as aligned with India. Now, please, pray, explain to me what is the historic basis of suddenly claiming an entire province? There's no rationale there.
Sir, first of all, Chinese position has never changed. China has never recognized the Arunachal Pradesh as Indian territory. That's number one. Number two is that there are historical reasons to back this up. Because if you go through the Arunachal history for hundreds of years in the past, you will see this is very much part of the Tibetan territory. And Tibet, since the 13th century has been part of China. This is the reason. And this is the historical reason. This is on the people-to-people reasons, for example. The fact that India has
by the way, since we are talking
Indian
historical facts,
doesn't make any sense.
The very first time that China claimed all of Arunachal Pradesh, not the saying that the McMahon line is not something that they would recognize. That they've been saying for a number of years, a number of decades now. But the very first time that China officially said that they do not recognize... One second, please. I've been covering MEA and diplomacy for the last 20 years, so I think I know what I'm talking about. The first time that China made this claim of the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh not being Indian and belonging to them was as recently as 2006, 2007. So let's not mix historical facts with positions that China has taken in the recent past. But let me ask Ellen Dolkar, who's a member of Parliament of the Tibetan government in exile here in India. This is, again, they say when you're negotiating with the Chinese, they have this habit of taking a maximalist position. So this you could view as a maximalist position that's being taken. But ultimately, you look at the situation in Ladakh, I think China also realizes that the kind of salami slicing that they are hoping to do or were hoping to do and that they've mastered against other smaller countries, that's not quite working out. That is not quite working out. There is a troop-to-troop situation there. There are 50,000 troops on either side, and neither side is willing to concede an inch. Yes, the standoff has been going on for 3 years, far longer than perhaps what China expected, but it's not like India is relenting. Ellen Dolkar.
Well, let me just clarify that I think it's important to reassert the fact that Xi Jinping's expansionist policy is just an extension of Mao's ambitious integration of the so-called motherland that we've just heard from my co-panelist. So we are looking into this propaganda version of China's history, where they mention the 13th century and the 17th century, since Tibet has been claiming to be part of China. But this is a manipulated history where, if this is the way they want to put it, even China was occupied by the Manchus and they were occupied by the Mongolians. So it's better if they stop their CCP propaganda to claim that Tibet was part of China. This is the same manipulation they're using to claim over Arunachal Pradesh or any part of India. And I think it's important for India to realize that, this was the same claim that led to the illegal occupation of Tibet. And now an attempt to erase the Tibetan identity by Chinese Communist Party. And this is the reality where this systematic and sophisticated program of CCP propaganda is now leading to the expectation of India of somehow resolving this territorial dispute with some sort of diplomatic engagement or peaceful negotiation. Honestly, for me, I feel like, if we really ought to assert the reality, it's important that India really opens up and asserts what is actually India. So, if India actually, look at what is happening today. This so-called standard map had always been claimed by China. It's not a new news. And this is a reality that India must realize, that CCP will continue to do that, especially so under the leadership of Xi Jinping, because this is how they took over Tibet, how they took over the independent Tibet. And they try to do the same thing to not just India, now even Taiwan as well.
Okay. So, Victor Gao, can you explain? And I think Ellen Dolkar has a point.
Sure
has a point where she's saying
allow me to say one thing.
She's saying, and please, you have to give us a reasoning for this. That since Xi Jinping came to power, look at the territorial disputes that China has had with Japan, with Vietnam, with Malaysia, with Philippines, with Indonesia, and of course with India. The only common factor seems to be China and the Chinese leadership. And they seem to be having all these problems with these territorial disputes. None of these other countries are having any kind of disputes with each other. The common factor seems to be China. So
Allow
when the
allow me
world
to give you my
gets the
reasoning.
impression that China is going around instigating trouble, fishing in troubled waters in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and of course fishing or creating trouble in land borders with countries like India, the troublemaker seems to be China, not the other countries.
Allow me to give you my reasoning, okay? One by one. The distinguished panelist just now, the lady talked about Tibet. Name any country in the world which recognized Tibet as an independent sovereign country. Zero. That's the fact. You need to accept that fact. The Indian government never acknowledges Tibet as a sovereign, independent country. Period.
That's
If
why
you
it's
live in
important
India, you need
India
to
must
abide
wake
by
up.
Indian law. So abide by
This is what
Indian
China has
law
done to Tibet.
and recognize Tibet as part of China. Period. Now, you talked about Taiwan. Taiwan's recent history traced back all the way to the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, which formed the two pillars for the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945. This is the fact. Anyone can do some home research and recognize that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China. That's the fact. That's what the United States acknowledged and
China
accepted.
needs to stop being
That's
a bully.
the United Nations acknowledged and accepted. If anyone wants to challenge that, if anyone wants to say Taiwan is a separate country away from China, he or she is violating the one China policy.
But Mr.
he
Gao,
or she-
one second, Mr. Gao,
Yes.
there are 23 million people in Taiwan, and I bet you every last penny I have, you have a referendum in Taiwan today and ask them how many of these 23 million people want to go with China, want to reunify with China. I can assure you more than 95%, maybe 99% of the people will say they want to have nothing to do with China. That is the reality that you have to acknowledge. That is the reality that China and the CCP has to acknowledge.
Sir, I'm licensed as a lawyer in the state of New York. Let me teach you one basic thing. Even if 100% of the people in California want to be independent, they will not be able to be independent. Why? Because there is another constitutional process in the United States requiring 3/4 of the 50 other states to approve that. That's the hurdle for any state in the United States to become independent.
Mr. Gao,
you think
you are
100%
comparing one of the 50 states of the United States with another sovereign independent country which has had nothing to do with you since the founding of the modern-day People's Republic of China, since 1949. You cannot compare that with one state of the 50 United States. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm completely out of time. But General Narasimhan, I'll give you the final word. I have to wrap up in 30 seconds. What this does present to India is a unique challenge because you have this situation where India is clearly moving closer and closer in alignment with the United States, with countries like Japan. It's part of the Quad. And yet at the same time, India also wants to keep a foot in the door with multilateral sort of groupings like BRICS, for example, which just recently concluded their meeting, the G20, part of the SCO. How does India possibly walk this?
Yeah, that is the challenge which the diplomacy of India has actually successfully scaled. You please understand that, while we are also talking to China, we are also part in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are part of BRICS. We are also part of Quad. We are also part of Indo-Pacific. So this is the success of Indian diplomacy, which we need to actually acknowledge. That is number one.
Okay.
Number two, the issue now is actually India-China. What Professor Kao said, as you said, China actually started referring to Arunachal Pradesh as Southern Tibet only around 2005-06, as you mentioned, which is correct. Before that, there was no Southern Tibet. I don't know where it has come all of a sudden. That is number one.
Yeah.
Number two, I understand Mr. Ivan Chen, who was the representative of China in the McMahon line, in the Shimla Accord talks, actually had signed that map. China backtracked it subsequently is a different issue. So the point that remains is that there was an agreement on McMahon line. which China doesn't acknowledge anymore, which is a fact. In addition to that, you look at the Shanghai Gazetteer map, Shanghai postal maps of 1938. All of them show Aksai Chin as part of India. So this is something which I don't know.
All right.
If you go back and do the research, like Professor Kao said, you will get a different picture.
Okay, I'm completely out of time. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I'm totally out of time. Thank you very much, General Narasimhan, Victor Gao, and of course, Ellen Dolkar for joining us. We'll see how this plays out in the run-up to G20. In the meanwhile, thank you very much for tuning in.